Is it surprising to you that this kind of uprising, these clashes, are only happening now?
Well, it's the culmination of a long process of the dissolving of the Green Line that supposedly separates the Israel proper from the occupied territories, from the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, for many years, the Israeli government has acted as if the Green Line doesn't exist for itself and for the Jewish Israeli settlers. They just treat the occupied territories as an integral part of Israel. And international human rights groups and Israeli human rights groups are pointing out that it's one integrated country, except with different forms of discrimination, second-class citizenship in Israel, virtual apartheid in the occupied territories against Palestinians. And I think it's not surprising then that the Arab citizens of Israel are saying, right, the Green Line doesn't exist for us either. And the presence of these heavily armed Israeli troops on the street of Lod and other so-called mixed cities, which sort of indicates how segregated a lot of Israel is, on that very term, suggests that the whole line between Israel and the occupied territories is blurring in a really dangerous way.
So given all of that, is there any likelihood, do you think, that we could see some sort of sustained Palestinian uprising against Israeli rule?
It's possible. My guess is still that this is not the moment for that. I don't think we're quite there, but I do think we're getting a foretaste of what it will look like when it does come. It may actually happen now. My guess is it will happen sometime in the medium term, and it will be integrated. It will involve areas in Israel. It will involve unrest with Gaza. It will involve, clashes in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And I think there's a very great threat that the Israeli far right will try mass displacements of Palestinians under cover of that bigger uprising in order to try to create a situation where there are not so many Palestinians living in the de facto Jewish state.
This week seems to have certainly brought the Palestinian cause back to the forefront. It seems to almost have been forgotten for some time. More and more human rights groups are now using the word you used yourself, apartheid, to describe the Palestinian situation. Is that indeed what this is?
Yes, I think so. I mean, not in Israel proper. It's not that, but in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, it certainly is. Not necessarily because it's exactly like the old regime in South Africa, but because it does fit the definition of apartheid under international law. There are two relevant conventions that define it, and this certainly meets that definition. So yes, it is that. And the reason that people held off, people like me, I mean, for decades and decades, held off on using that word and warned people not to use it, was because we held out hope that the situation in the occupied territories was temporary, that it was a military occupation that would come to an end. But it's become increasingly clear that there's a consensus in Israel never to end it, just to adjust it, to give Palestinians at most what Prime Minister Netanyahu calls a state minus, which means no state at all, a little enclave of autonomy inside a greater Israel. And that looks like the other side of apartheid, which were the self-ruled African Bantustans, these fictional states inside South Africa. And so, the analogy becomes ever more painful. And what that means is conflict is more and more inevitable. People who thought this was over were deluding themselves completely. And I think it's amazing that Israeli society is so shocked to learn that they're still in a conflict. They've been lulled to sleep by their own leaders.
Hussein, we've just heard now that an Egyptian delegation is in Tel Aviv to try and negotiate a ceasefire in this conflict. Do you think that is cause for optimism?
Eventually, I'm sure the Egyptians will be the brokers, especially since this has now become centered between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Egypt borders Gaza, and it was in control of Gaza between 1948 and 1967. So it has a major role to play. It will broker with the support of other countries. So this is the beginning of the process that will create a ceasefire. But I think the Israelis are not going to allow Hamas Hamas to claim the victories that they were claiming in the past couple of days, Hamas started signaling as early as Tuesday that it had achieved its political aims and wanted a ceasefire. I think the Israelis are going to insist on a lot more destruction, a lot more mayhem before they allow this to come to a temporary end.
Hussein, thank you so much for that. That's Hussein Ibish, a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Thank you for speaking to us.